Thank you for coming for this screening of Djibril Diop Mambéty TOUKI BOUKI. A couple of years ago, we showed two of these beautiful short restore, Le Franc and The Little Girl That Stole the Sun. And I always wanted to do more work of this Senegalese filmmaker that is so brilliant and had a short life. And so unfortunately, we only have very little of the work. And this is a restoration that was sponsored by the World Cinema Fund, Martin Scorsese World Cinema Foundation. It's a beautiful film. It's a seminal film. And I am thrilled that to introduce this is a filmmaker from Italy and a friend. Jonas Carpignano is the director of CHIARA and Chambra, which you might have seen. And I kind of went on a lamb thinking that he would have an affinity with Mambéty's work, would have feel an affinity with Mambéty's work. And it turns out that I wasn't too far off. So Jonas kindly accepted to introduce the film for me and for you. And so here is Jonas from Gioia Tauro in Italy. And it's very late, so I don't think he'll be long. Hi, Jonas.
Thank you, first of all, Giulia, for inviting me. And thank you to everyone for sitting through this introduction, even though you guys don't have a choice. I was really honored when Giulia wrote me about this film. In fact, she texted me out of blue and wrote, "How do you feel about TOUKI BOUKI?" And I didn't know where to begin. You know, the same way I kind of don't know where to begin even now, talking about a film that I love so much and that I think is important. Not just, you know, a lot of people talk about it within the context of African cinema, but I think it's a film that's important for cinema in general as a whole. You know, I don't want to bog down this introduction with too much, you know, historical context, but I think it's important to mention, you know, this was the third film made by this filmmaker, the first feature film after he made two short films. And I think it's important to note that, you know, he was a debut filmmaker without any traditional schooling. He worked and he acted for a brief period of time in a small theater company in Senegal, but you know, he wasn't someone who was trained formally. And I think that that's one of the things that makes this film very special, is that, you know, it's a film that when it came out in 1973 was in stark difference to all of the other films, African films that had been very well known at the time. You know, it's obviously, I don't want to talk about the dichotomy between, you know, the father of African cinema, Ousmane Sembène, and this filmmaker, but obviously, you know, this film as a reaction to the other African films that had been in the limelight at that time is sort of important for understanding why I love this film and why I think this film is so special. I mean, you know, traditionally, the African cinema that had begun to flourish in the 60s, known as the third cinema, was, you know, very much based in social realism. And here we have a filmmaker who sort of wanted to do something completely different. And he did it not through telling a different narrative, because in many ways, the film you're about to see has a pretty traditional, straightforward narrative. If you think about it, you know, it's about a young man and his girlfriend trying to flee Senegal to get to Paris. You know what I mean? I made a film about something like that. Lots of films have been made about that topic. But what's special about this film is how he does it. You know, and I think that the thing that's exceptional about this film is about him as a filmmaker, this film in general. It's not simply that it's a film that is quote unquote avant-garde. It's not simply that it's a film that, again, tries to differentiate itself from the other African cinema. It's a film that feels like it's made by the protagonist and by the very themes that the film is trying to challenge, right? So I think that what touches me about this film, and the reason why I go back to it over and over, is it's a film that, in its refusal of adopting a more traditional cinematic grammar, it sort of thematically reinforces what's happening on the screen through its cinematic language. So, you know, to sort of say that more simply, you know, in African literature, for example, you know, Chinua Achebe was one of my favorite writers. You know, he wrote this wonderful novel called Things Fall Apart, you know, and for a long time, you know, there was an open debate about that film, because on one hand, you know, it's a film that provided a look into an African village, the outskirts of Nigeria, that had never before been seen. But, you know, he was also criticized by some African scholars because to tell that story, he ultimately adopted a 5-act structure and sort of told that as if it was a Greek tragedy, right? So often people thought, you know, why use this language, a language of, you know, quote unquote, another culture to tell this story? And he always said, I did it to make it more accessible. right? Because to me, by adopting this structure, by adopting this, more people will be able to relate to themes that are very foreign to them. Here, we have a filmmaker doing the exact opposite. We have a filmmaker who refuses to adopt conventional cinematic norms and traditions the way that other African filmmakers at the time did, to sort of say that for us to tell our own stories, we also need to try to invent our own language. We need to sort of tell it in a way that, for lack of a better word, refuses the colonizer's context and grammar and embraces its own. So it's a film that really is born out of the characters and the place that it's coming from. And that's ultimately why I love this film more than anything. The way that it's not just avant-garde for the sake of being avant-garde. It's not experimental for the sake of stylistic purposes. It's doing so to reinforce what this filmmaker believes to be important about cinema, which is that a cinema born out of a place should have its own grammar, its own rules, and its own way of expression. Otherwise, that story could be contained or contextualized in a language which does not fully understand the subject matter and the place that it's describing. And, in my work in the past, I've always tried to use that as sort of a guiding principle. I've made films about communities that are very distant from me in the past. I made a film about the Roma community here. I made a film about a very particular Calabrian family down here. And for me, when I was making those films, I always tried to eschew my background and my bringing privilege the point of view of the people that was making a film about. So I tried to make the film with people as opposed to about people, and I tried to sort of change the rules of what is a traditional screenwriting structure or a traditional filmmaking structure for these films in order to give more space to the people that I was making the film about, right? So in that way, trying not to fit people's lives into cinematic norms and story structures that, are often taught in universities and places where people have formal training come from. So I think that, ultimately the film you're about to see is traditional in its story when you think about what happens in the narrative, but it's anything but that when it comes to the cinematic grammar and the moments that are created in this film. And I think that it's epically enjoyable because every time you see it, something different comes out of it. You know what I mean? The intentions of the filmmaker are not explicit in terms of exposition, in terms of the stories that unfolds, but in terms of the language and in terms of how the certain contrasts and juxtapositions through editing are put forth. And again, it's hard to talk about forcing film, but I think, for example, there's a scene you guys will see very early on in the film, which is essentially a sex scene. And the way that that's done is clearly different from anything else that's been done in African cinema up until that point. So look out for that when you guys are about to see it. It's hard to talk about a film when I can't see you guys and your reaction. So I hope I didn't go on for too long. But again, I'm very, very envious that you guys get to see this on a big screen. I think you guys are all very lucky that this festival exists and that Giulia is putting this together for you guys all to watch. So I'm envious of you guys, and I'm grateful to have been able to participate from here. Thank you, Giulia, for letting me introduce this film, and I hope you guys all like it.
Thank you, Jonas. And the film that of Jonas that is as explicit affinities thematically with this is Mediterranean. And I didn't mention it before, but you should seek it because it's very beautiful, and you should be able to see it here. Thank you again, Jonas, and good night. It's very late there. Bye bye.
Bye. Thank you.